Hello everybody, how are you? Today we have lesson number 6, and lesson number 6 it's about which one is better. Which one is better? Slash n new line or end line new line. Of course, the developers, they're not stupid to create for us two things to do the one thing. They not create for us slash n to do new line and end line to do also new line. For sure there is a difference between them, and let's go to see in this lesson what is the difference between them. All right, we have here a program. You should already know what this program is, and you should to know if I did run to this program, what kind of result I will get on the black screen or console screen. But because we're still in the beginning of the roadmap, let us explain it again. All right, let us read what this program contains. This program contains from hashtag include IOStream, using namespace std colon, semicolon. You should to know also why we use this using namespace std semicolon. We use this to take permission from the compiler until the compiler believes we want to use cout object without using std colon colon with it anymore. All right, and after that we have integer main function, parentheses, curly bracket. We come back again to our line of code, cout, insertion operator, double quotation, some from pre-programming school, double quotation, less than, end line, semicolon. All right, which one is better? Which one is better? Should I use end line or should I use slash n? Because the second line of code, sorry, here one double quotation, it was just mistakes. The second line of code, it's same exactly like the upper line of code. But in the upper line of code, I just use end line to give me a new line. And in the second line of code, I use slash n also to give me a new line. So what is the difference between them? All right. In C++ programming language, we have something we called it buffer. In C++ programming language, we have something we called it buffer. And you can imagine this buffer as a small table that can hold 50 lines of code. Buffer also known as temporary storage, but now you can imagine it as a table. It has borders. You cannot write or you cannot put inside this buffer more than 50 lines of code. And let's assume also that we have application contain from 1,000 lines of code. Let's assume that we together build application, and this application contain from 1,000 lines of code. When I do run to this application that we build it together, that it's contained from 1,000 lines of code, when you do run to this application, the compiler go take the code of this application, which is 1,000 lines of code, put it inside the buffer that just handle 50 lines of code. Put it inside the buffer, organize it as a queue, step by step, one line of code, and after that, another line of code, and try, and after that, start to shake your code. Check if there is any syntax error or bugs or anything wrong or any problems with your code. So when you do run and compiler take your code and put it in this buffer that just handle 50 lines of code and your application contain from 1,000 lines of code, the buffer, it will be full, and that lead to make your application performance slow. And that's happen when I just use in my lines of code /n. If I just use /n in all my lines of code, with each text or with each line of code that I need to use /n, I use just /n. That's lead to make the compiler not do flush to the buffer. What does mean flush? Flush would mean the compiler will not empty the buffer. We as a developer, we said the compiler never do or not do flush to the buffer, which means your code, it doesn't have anything to let the compiler do flush to the buffer, which means empty the buffer. That's happened when we just use /n. When we just use /n, the compiler take your code, put it in the buffer full. That's lead to make your application performance slow. The compiler keep going to put more code in the buffer that is actually full. After check all the codes, after the compiler check all the codes that he put it in the buffer, after that, the compiler will do flush to the buffer after check everything, which means the performance of application is so bad and not in good quality. This is the first practice. This is the first practice that I just explained it now. As I said, this is the first practice, or temporary storage, because the buffer is known also as a temporary storage. So this is the first practice. The first practice, as you see here, in all my lines of code, I just use /n/n/n. I reach here, the buffer, it's already full. The code is already out of the buffer, but the compiler, it doesn't do here flush to the buffer. Complete put more lines of code, which means we said it's lead to make our application performance slow. And after the compiler finish putting the code in the buffer and check them all, there is no syntax error or anything. After that, the compiler will do flush to the buffer, which means will empty the buffer. This is the first practice, and it's not good if you have a big application that contains from 1,000 lines of code. And the second practice that I use with each line of code, end line. That's tell the compiler, please, after you finish checking the line of code, go do flush to the buffer. And that's also lead to make your application slow. You will tell me how. I did end line, or I use end line, and that's make the compiler do flush after each line of code, which means the buffer it's empty. I'll tell you, yes, the buffer it's empty, but in this practice, the second one, you make the compiler busy, instead check 50 lines of code together or 20 lines of code together, and after that do flush to the buffer. You make the compiler busy, after checking one lines of code, go to the buffer, go to flush to the buffer. Check the second line of code, go to flush to the buffer. Check the third line of code, go do flush to the buffer. That's take time, and the compiler and the application performance becomes slow. So the second practice also is not idle practice to use it, because it's make your application performance slow. This is the second practice. The third practice, it's about that we use with some of lines of code that we have it in our program. As we said, let's assume that we have application contain from 1,000 lines of code. So in the first 50 lines of code, I will use just /n to not make the compiler busy and just check the code. And in the line of code number 51, I will use one end line to make the compiler do flush to the buffer and not make the buffer full, to not lead to make our application performance slow. So this is the best practice. The third practice is the best practice. If my application contains from 1,000 or 200, even 300 lines of code, I start to use with every 50 line of code or 30 lines of code, I start to use one end line to make the compiler do flush to the buffer when the buffer already become close to be full. But if my application is small, not contains from 1,000 of line, for example, lines of code, for example, my application small and just contain from 50 lines of code or 30 lines of code, 20 lines of code, no need to use end line. Use just /n and the buffer, it will never be empty. So that was the difference between /n and end line. And a lot of developers, seniors even developers, don't know the difference. Yeah, it's simple thing. It's not the big thing that it's make your application performance high, but also these things that what is like distinguishes you between the developer and the company. The company, when saw you care about the application or software that you build it, and even focus about the small things like this to make the performance of the application good and in high quality. That's it, that what is make you different between the developers in the field and the company. What is also make your salary different than the other developer in the company, because they appreciate you and they saw how you good developer, how you good developer. So and these concepts plus these concepts, you will never have it if you start your journey with Python or JavaScript instructor or interpreter language, or even with many high-level language. Yeah, buffer, it's known in a lot of programming language, but you will not know the concepts of the buffer if you start with Python or JavaScript or with some high-level programming language, because C++, as I said, it's gonna force you to know the main or the important concept that you should to have it, and you should to know it as a developer, and you should to know how it's working background, and that's what's make it different, as I said. That was the lesson of today, guys. See you next lesson. Ciao.